make it as best we can. And I think Karen is trying to join us. I was having a little trouble, but hopefully she'll be with us shortly. The way this works is that we, you ask us anything. So it can really be anything related to fundraising and not-for-profits. And you can type in whatever questions you have in the chat, or you can use the Q&A function and just type them in there. So whatever works best for you is fine with us. But so we'll give people a minute to join us. But why don't we dive in, Laurel? And so summer is coming up, right? We're kind of in the last couple of months where we can really make a difference in our fundraising before the summer comes, and we can't do much, or at least things slow down considerably. So I think there's a few things to talk about around that while we wait for other people to join us. So one is just sort of mid-course corrections and starting to think about mid-course corrections. So what should we be thinking about? How do we evaluate if we need a mid-course correction, and what should we be thinking about around mid-course corrections?
It's funny because I feel like every year I keep theorizing that we need to start planning for end of year, like earlier and earlier all the time. And I think in some ways, like this is the best time to start planning for the end of year, even though it feels like we're only, it's only May. Like, why are we already talking about end of year? But the problem is we tend to wait. And then we get to October, November to really start thinking about our end of year strategies. And by then it is way too late to do anything of substance. And so I think being able to start now, thinking about, all right, well, let's reflect. Let's think about this first 4 or 5 months of the year. What worked? What didn't work? Where are we? Revisiting your table of gifts. If you don't have a table of gifts, you should let us know and we'll help you pull that together. But not just bottom line, right? I think there's a lot of focus on, progress to date in terms of our bottom line. And yes, that's absolutely important. But I think it's also a time to really take stock on your strategies, what's working, where have you seen some surprise successes, and then getting ahead of that end of year chunk of work. And you're right, Bob. I think a lot of people look at the summer and say, people are out of town, people are on vacation. My board members aren't here. My, staff are in and out. It's really hard to do substantive work. But I think in some ways that makes the summer the best time to do this work of just thinking through what's working, what's not working. And then so come September 1st, you are hitting the ground running with your end of year strategy, just boom, gone, right? Because again, I think people tend to wait until, again, like October, November to even think about or start that strategy. Your end of year strategy really should start in September. So I think being prepared to do that.
Yeah, that's a really interesting thought, but I think it kind of makes sense, right? Because it takes, what we do today is going to have an influence 3 to 6 months from now, right? So from a fundraising perspective, essentially it's already August, right? We're already there, and it may be as late as November, depending on how you want to think about it. And so, taking a look at, who has normally given by this time of year but hasn't. What is your year to date? Is that off? Are you on track? What did you expect to happen? And is it happening? Are you hitting those metrics in your development plan that we all know you have? Are you hitting your prospecting metrics that we all know that you have? These are all good things, I think I agree, to start thinking about now while you still have a little time to prepare and a little time and, and a significant amount of time to actually do something about that. And so I think that makes a lot of sense. And sometimes I think when we look at that information, we realize that we really need a strategic change. Sometimes it's just tactical. Sometimes it's just a matter of, just working our list and making sure that we ask everybody and doing just some small tactical things to make sure the money comes in. But sometimes, particularly in these uncertain times, it may mean, hey, the thing I thought was going to work isn't working, and you still want to have enough time do something about it. And I think the summer is actually a really good time to make whatever kind of course corrections that you may need, and revise anything that needs revision, and really give yourself enough time to kind of put on that full court press.
Absolutely. I also, I more and more, I have this sneaking suspicion about end of year fundraising, and I feel like there's a real chicken and egg quality to end of year. And I have theories. I haven't, really tried to prove or disprove any of them, but I have a sneaking suspicion that there's kind of equally a bunch of factors that go into why we raise, a third of our nonprofit fundraising in the last 3 months of the year. I think part of it, some of it is tax deductions, but now with, charitable itemized deductions and all of those changes, that's fewer and fewer, some of the motivation. I also think it's interesting that people kind of look at tax deduction as a primary reason that they're spending so much effort in fundraising in the last few months of the year, when most of what organizations are spending their time on is like direct mail and e-appeal fundraising, which is not major gift fundraising. So definitely not impacting the people who are itemizing, right? So,
Right.
So it's, let's be clear about why we're doing certain things. I also think, there's a chicken and egg thing that says, well, part of why most people give at the end of the year is because that's when we ask them. And so I always think like, well, gosh, are there things we can be doing to spread out our strategies throughout the year so that we're taking that pressure off of ourselves to do all of our fundraising at the end of the year? And I think especially for organizations that are on a calendar year, fiscal year, leaving that to the last few months and to cross your fingers and hope that you get there, I think we're adding undue stress to ourselves by not getting ahead of it. So, even now too, in the next month or two, looking through who do we typically ask in those last couple of months, and why do we typically ask them in the last couple of months? And are there a few asks that we can get in earlier just to take some of that pressure off of ourselves and lighten our to-do list, at the end of the year? So, are there, if we typically have 50 mid-level and major donors that we typically make asks of in the last 2 months of the year, maybe 10 of them, they are very clear that that's when they give, but maybe 40 of them never said that to us, and maybe we could make an ask in September, right? So I think that's a really another thing to just kind of think about and kind of test your assumptions about why you're doing so much of that work in the last few months, and try to get ahead of it a little bit.
Yeah, I think that all makes a lot of sense. I want to ask you a question, but first I want to remind people who are online to type whatever questions you have in the chat or in the Q&A. No question is too big or too small. There might be some questions that are too big, but you can try us, and we'll see what happens. So a lot of organizations' fiscal years are ending on June 31st, which means you really have 2 months really to kind of do something about that. And what I find is that sometimes there's a certain panic involved with that, right? And so, because our fiscal year is up, and because we maybe as a development officer are evaluated on, whether we hit our goal or not in that time, I think sometimes, we don't always treat these last 2 months the way I would say that we should, and employ the tactics that I think would probably be most effective. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about, what strategies we should employ if, it's May 6th, we have 7 weeks to do some fundraising, which, like I mentioned, is within that window of real uncertainty about whether you can actually do anything before the end of the fiscal year.
I always feel like such a broken record, because my response to like 75% of the questions I get asked is table of gifts, right? So, first and foremost, that's the first. If I'm feeling a ton of pressure about meeting my goal, and if I'm uncertain at all about how and if I'm going to meet that goal, the first place I'm going is my table of gifts, right? It's the first thing when I can't sleep and I'm up all night stressed and anxious and worried, the first thing I'm doing when I get back to my office the next morning is opening up my table of gifts and just getting a lay of the land. And, there's no better tool to help us see where we are today, where we need to go, what that gap is, and then start to figure out how we close the gap. I think sometimes part of the anxiety and the stress of hitting these goals and hitting those gaps is just the uncertainty of it all. Not even having a sense of, we look at these big numbers. I've got $200,000 more to raise this year. I've got, $30,000 more to raise, or whatever the number is that's feeling overwhelming. It feels big and it feels nebulous. And I think by looking at our table of gifts, looking at what gifts have come in, checking in to see which gifts we thought would come in that haven't come in yet, starting with the lowest hanging fruit and then working our way forward, like looking at, who gave last year that still hasn't given this year, going back and saying, all right, let's start there. Let's get those renewed gifts from people who have already given. Once we've crossed that off, then starting to close the gap around, all right, so how many new prospects do we need and what can we do really quickly? And I think, again, we always talk about, your next best gift is somebody who's already given to you. I think so the first place I'm always going to start to hit the gap are people who have already given. And once they've made their gifts and I need new prospects, I'm going to go back to that well again and have those people be the first people I ask to introduce me to new people who might give to us, right? So, again, and where your table of gifts can be a really powerful tool with your board, with donors, with other volunteers, is to be able to show them that table of gifts and say, look, here's the gap. Here's where we are. Here's our gap. Here's what we still need to raise this year. I would love to just sit down and brainstorm with you who you might know in these categories of giving that we could engage sometime in the next few weeks. And, again, the people who are closest to you are going to be your best resource for finding new folks rather than you trying to go out and do cold calling or, suddenly find some prospect who's never given before.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. And one thing I would add is maybe what not to do, because I think, again, sometimes we get caught up in what is an arbitrary internal designation, right? Our fiscal year means nothing to anyone outside of our organization. In fact, it probably means nothing to most people within the organization if you're not in development or in finance, HR side of things. So no one cares that it's the end of your fiscal year. And so that's not like a great reason for people to give. And I get not a lot, but I get enough that I've noticed where people are really pushing us as donors to give because the end of the fiscal year is ending, as opposed to, the impact that you're going to have and the outcomes you're trying to achieve and how it's going to impact the people that you serve and the communities that you serve. So, giving to meet a goal or giving to meet like an arbitrary deadline, for the most part, there's some exceptions I can think of, is not a great way to fundraise. And then the other thing to do is to keep in mind around your fiscal situation overall. If I can ask for some money in July and get more money in July, but miss the end of this fiscal year from any one given donor, then I'm going to do that unless we're in some financial crisis, right? Where it must be in, it isn't just an internal designation, but it's in fact a real financial issue that we need the money now as opposed to later, which brings up a whole host of other questions if that's the case. But just to keep in mind that, like, if you have to delay something for a month or two to get more because you're able to cultivate that person or strengthen that relationship or take care of something that you need to take care of that increases your chances of being successful, then I would do that and not be caught up in our own designations that are arbitrary ultimately, at least from a development standpoint. So we have a couple of questions. We have 2 questions from Lynn. First question is, what would be the best approach to market stock donations as a giving option for donors?
An interesting question, and I'll be really interested in your thoughts on this too, Bob. I think we have to always be cognizant of how we're making asks compared to what we're hoping to get back from them, right? I have this little chart that I use a lot that kind of has the giving pyramid, and it's like our broad-based lower dollar donors, our mid-level donors, major gift, legacy, and then kind of the strategies that we tend to use or that we need to use to get those sized gifts. And I think recognizing that stock donations tend to be bigger gifts. So, when we're talking about gifts of stock, we're not talking about a $25 response to a direct mail appeal, right? And so if we're talking about gifts of stock, we're probably talking about mid-level or major gift level donations, to which I would say then, if that is in fact the group, then it isn't about broad-based marketing. It isn't about putting this in our direct mail. I mean, sure. Should you put that as an option in your next e-appeal that, you can give a gift of cash and you can give a gift of stock? And yeah, sure. Always put those options out there, because you never know when you're going to catch somebody's attention who maybe says, oh, I hadn't really thought about this, or, giving to this organization that way. And maybe that increases their gift. But if we're really talking about reaching out to people to give major gifts, these are conversations that we're having with folks. And so I think it's less about broad-based marketing and more about how do we just feel confident enough in our knowledge of how that mechanism works, that if it comes up or if we're talking to a major donor, we can put it out there to say, oh, and also just wanted to make sure you knew that we're set up to take these types of gifts, and here's how this works at our organization, right? So I think there's a piece of this that's about us being knowledgeable and confident to talk about it with donors, and then sure, put it in your marketing materials. But I think keep your expectations tempered that a direct mail or a direct email appeal is not really the place that the mechanism that's going to result in a big gift of stock.
Yeah, I would agree with you, right? It's a mechanism for making a gift that you've already agreed to make. So the issue is much less about like how do we do it, and just signaling to people that yes, we are capable of accepting a gift of stock. Is a useful thing, but as part of your, and you should include it in your just general fundraising things, just to let people know. But I think to answer your follow-up question, Lynn, yeah, I mean, stock donations are going to come from a pretty specific demographic. It's going to come from people who are wealthy, or people who are wealthy above a certain age. So, and we're generalizing, but if you're 25 and you're making millions of dollars a year at Goldman, you're still probably not giving gifts of stock, right? Because you don't know how many kids you're going to have, what they're going to be doing, what houses you may want to buy. You don't really know. You're still, and the value of that stock at that stage, I mean, the hope is that, right, it'll accumulate, right? That it will appreciate. And so why am I giving it away when I just bought it, when the hope is that, it's going to appreciate in some way? So there's a lot of disincentives if I'm young to give stock away, and there's a lot of disincentives if I'm not wealthy to give assets away, because that's what we're talking about. It's an asset. So again, to Laurel's point, Lynn, you can please, just like plain giving, there's a lot to be said for just putting it in your general marketing materials. But I think what we're saying is, like, don't expect a flood of stock to come in because you did that. It will come in because you're having specific conversations with specific donors. It's not really a direct marketing exercise. It is a relationship building exercise. If that.
And I would just like put a pin in what you said about it's a mechanism. It's not whether I'm going to give cash versus stock versus crypto versus whatever. That gift could go to anybody. So your job is less about marketing the mechanism. Your job is marketing your organization. So first and foremost, the first thing you're saying is, here's the impact we're having, here's what a gift of X size could do. How they end up giving you that gift is kind of secondary. And to Bob's point, you need to let them know you are capable of taking this gift. But I'm not sure, again, I think the first and foremost thing I'm going to focus on is why they should give to you from an impact standpoint versus why they should give to you because you take stock. I mean, because everybody takes stock. So, I think that's the big focus.
Yeah, exactly. Hopefully that answers your question, Lynn. I remember lots of days when I was a junior officer having to wait right around New Year's for the stock to come in because everyone would make the last minute stock gifts. And I was so glad when I was the director of development, I can make someone else do that. Be in the office. Okay, well, Lynn also asked a second question. How would you establish a relationship with a new foundation funder who doesn't accept unsolicited proposals and there's no obvious connector that can provide an introduction? I have thoughts, but do you have any? You want me to go? Okay, sure. Yeah, so I think this is an interesting question. So what you're saying, one, I totally understand you're saying you have no obvious connections. What I would say though, in general, and then I'll more directly answer your question, a great exercise is to start to collect who you know and who people know. And so having some kind of screening list or some way of talking to your donors is a great engagement opportunity, because it's really easy to make foundation introductions, right? Because they exist to give money away. So if I know someone at a foundation, that's a much easier call for me to make than to call my friend from college or the person that I haven't talked to in a while that I should have, but now we want money from him or her. So it's a much easier ask. And just having a sense, just kind of having going around and just having like a list. What are the 30 most most likely foundations to give to my organization? And just starting to map those relationships. Just as you're talking to people, just get a sense of who knows who, from, directly from your donors, from your board. You're like, oh, I think Laurel might know someone over there, and just starting to map that out. So that's one thing. So that when you do need to make that inquiry, when you do want the money or to make a proposal, you kind of have found that connection if you can. The second thing to do is I like to play the long game. And so again, establishing what are the 30, 20, 40, whatever it is, depending on the size of your organization, is most likely to give to my organization. And I start sending them materials and updates now, whether I need money from them today or not, because someday I may want to ask them for something. I don't know whether they're reading them. I don't know to what extent they're paying attention, but at a minimum, it's going to create a sense of dynamism, right? Like, oh, they're doing stuff over there. I'm not reading it. I'm not really, looking at it super carefully, maybe at first, but like, oh, there's stuff happening. And maybe over time I start to read it and start to look at it and start to get a sense of things. And then maybe, I'm approaching you in some way. So I find that to be a pretty good way of doing things. Because the problem is that we kind of approach foundations when we need them today, right? When we need them today, it's too late often. So we want to kind of think about when might we need them and lay the groundwork for that, so that when we do need them, they're ready and we have some opportunity. That said, if a foundation really, really doesn't want you to solicit a proposal, there's not tons you can do about it. And so the third thing I would say is you have to think about how good a prospect is this, right? Like if you have no way of reaching them, you may want to deprioritize them until you find some way in. I don't know if you have any thoughts, Laurel.
Yeah, one thought I will add is you mentioned kind of going to folks and saying, who do you know, and cross-referencing those lists. I would actually even take a more proactive approach to that. I think we do tend to go to our other funding partners, our board members, our volunteers, other people in our circle, and kind of just say like, well, who do you know? But that's a very broad question, and I don't even know who I know, right? Like I could kind of say like, yeah, I guess I know these people, but I really love taking a more direct kind of peer screening approach to this, where what are those 4 or 5 foundations that you're trying to get in front of right now? Who is on their board of directors? Who are their program officers? Have that in a list that you're sharing with people, so that it's not just kind of like, oh, you're not leaving it up to people to think off the top of their head. They can actually run through a list and say, oh, I didn't even know that he was on that board. Yeah, I know him, right? Like, so I think you'll find that if you are a little more proactive, you provide your contacts, your board members, your other funders with a list of specific names that they can kind of go through, then you're probably going to get a little bit more success with people being like, oh yeah, actually I do know them. I'd be happy to make a phone call or shoot them an email or whatever it might be. I think also making it really clear to those folks that you're asking to be peer screeners, why you believe this foundation is a good fit for you. So I would say, kind of, just making sure that you're assuring them that if they make that connection, that this is a good value for that time. So, and then just to follow up with Lynn's email, I would send it in the way that you're going to send that communication anyway. So if you're putting out an annual report and you're sending it by mail, add that foundation to that mailing list and mail it to them. If you are sending out an emailed annual report, send it to whatever email address you can get. I mean, sometimes with these foundations, you may only be able to get a general like info at address off of their website. So, I mean, sometimes you don't necessarily have an option for who you're going to email. I think you send it to whoever you can get an email address for. And if you do have options, then you just figure out, do you have multiple program officers that you have email addresses for? If so, pick the program officer whose area of focus is closest to the one that your organization is operating within. So, in some ways it's like do what you can and then move on kind of thing.
And mix it up too, because you don't know whether some people are mail people, some people are email people, if you can do that. All right, we have 3 minutes and we have one last question. What do you say to yet another board member who won't donate financially because they say, I donate my time? Well, I know we have lots to say, probably beyond 3 minutes. So let's try to hit the core.
Half an hour to talk about this question, but I will say that a lot of this is about setting expectations before those board members ever come onto your board.
Yes.
I think first that's the biggest piece of this is you need to be making it crystal clear when you are recruiting people to be on your board. If you have an expectation to make a gift, a cash donation to your organization, that it is explicit and clear and
before you let them on the board.
Before you ever let them on the board. In fact, we believe strongly that you should never even be recruiting people to be on your board who've never given your organization a gift. People should already be generous donors and supporters to your organization before you even ask them to be members of your board, if in fact giving and fundraising are part of your board expectations. Now, if you have a board where that's not the expectation, then maybe that's not a priority. But if in fact there's 100% board giving, then you should be getting a gift before they join the board and then making sure when they join the board it's explicit. Now, if that hasn't happened and they're on your board, I think then you have there's some opportunities for the board as a whole to have discussions about what are the expectations to be on this board. If in fact giving is an expectation, I would say, the best strategy is I want other board members, probably your board president, maybe the chair of your fund development committee, to be the ones who are peer-to-peer going to those board members and saying, look, these are the expectations of being on this board. This is something we've all committed to doing. If in fact you aren't on board with us, maybe there's another way for you to be engaged and involved with the organization, but maybe board membership isn't for you. I mean, quite frankly, I think I'm not going to spend a ton of time trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. If somebody is just adamant that they don't make, or they're not going to make a financial gift, I think then the onus goes to the board to say, then we have to not have this person on the board. And that's my quick and harsh answer, because we don't have a lot of time to respond to this, but I think it's recruitment and then it's accountability and holding people accountable.
Yeah, and I think you really hit the essentials there, Laurel. It is really being very clear on a collective basis, like what are the overall board responsibilities and expectations, and also on an individual basis, what are my expectations for you? Because your board can have different expectations for different people, but yes, if giving is an expectation, then you should be very clear before you ever put someone on the board. And again, we're not saying the amount, or that's a different conversation, and we think everyone should be generous within their own means, but there are exceptions to that as well. But having clarity, I know that I find it very helpful when I understand what my collective duties are, but also what do they want from Robert Osborne? Like what do they want? What do they want from me? And so that I can execute on them, because there's nothing worse than being a volunteer and not really knowing what you're supposed to do. Like that's not a great feeling. It's a feeling of sort of wasting your time. All right, everyone. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. We think we'll probably have one more before the summer, and then I think we'll probably take a 2-month break while we all go on vacation. But hopefully you will all join us again at the June Ask Me Anything. But until then, thanks so much for joining us, and goodbye.
Take care.